Hey friends, welcome back to another video. What'd you think of that cool B-roll sequence? Annabelle and I just filmed that whilst we were waiting for some fish and chips at the Bermuda Harbour when we were there for our holiday. Just banged out a quick sequence. I thought it was pretty cool. Now you would have noticed this little shot in there, and it's sort of this freeze pose trail effect, where your subject sort of walks through the shot and there are these freeze frames that are tracked into the shot. And as the character hits that pose in the freeze frame, they sort of collect it and the next one comes in. So what I wanted to do today was teach you how I made that effect so that you can create it for yourself and use it in your own films. Let's jump right in. So just a quick note on shooting before we get into the editing side of things. What we want to do is just have a shot where we are following the subject as they move through the scene and the subject is hitting cool poses at given points. And all you want to do is just sort of try and keep the entirety of the subject in the frame and also keep the shot stable. So I find that the more stable a shot is, the easier it is to add these freeze frames. So I use my DJI RS2 gimbal to keep it nice and smooth. Once you have your shot, we can jump into the editing. Let's go. Okay, so I've got my footage here inside of After Effects. I'm going to go ahead and drag it into a new composition. Here we go. Okay, so if we watch the footage through, you can see that Annabelle is hitting certain cool poses at certain points. So step one is just going to be to watch through this footage and we're just going to add a marker anywhere that we want a freeze frame to be. So I'm going to look for cool poses and we're going to add a little marker in there. So maybe we'll do a marker here at this pose, just like that. Maybe we'll put a marker on this pose here. Right about there looks good. Right about there looks pretty good, I think. So now what we want to do is basically export the frame at each of these markers into a Photoshop file so we can cut out our subject from the background, and then we'll be able to use that cutout subject back in After Effects as the freeze frame pose that we can just track into the shot. I'm gonna right click on the marker, select Go to Marker Time, then I'm gonna come up to Composition, Save Frame As, and then select Photoshop Layers. Now I can go ahead and save these wherever I want, and I'm just gonna name it Still 1, and click Save. Now I'm going to do the same thing with all the other markers. Now I'm going to go to my Finder. I'm going to find my stills folder. I'm going to select all of my files and say Open with Adobe Photoshop. So now inside of Photoshop, what we want to do is find a way to cut out our subject. There are a lot of different ways to do that. I'm going to show you a pretty simple way here. Whichever way you want to use will work just fine. I'm going to go up to my Quick Selection tool. I'm going to hit this Select Subject option. That does a pretty good job of selecting our subject. We can just go ahead and make some refinements. When you're happy with it, you can just go ahead and make a layer mask by clicking on that little button down the bottom there. Looks like we have some things we're going to fix, so we can just go ahead and brush those out if we want to. So I'm just using a variety of filters here, mostly just using that minimum filter to remove those fringing edges, and then using a bunch of brushes on my mask just to remove the parts I don't want. I'm just trying to get to the most pleasing cutout that I can. The hair will be a little bit difficult to do, but it might not matter too much in the final image anyway. Once I'm happy with my cutout, I'm just going to go ahead and save the Photoshop document, and that'll be ready to put back into After Effects. I'm just going to go ahead and cut out the other three subjects now. So I'll end up with all of my freeze frames with my subject cut out on a transparent background, all saved, ready to go back into After Effects. I'll meet you there in just a second. A good thing about using Photoshop files as opposed to exporting out the images is that the Photoshop files actually can be updated and the results will be updated inside of After Effects as well. So if I go back later and I decide, oh, actually I want to select my subject better than I did, all I have to do is reopen the Photoshop file, make my better selection, save it again, and the results will be updated into After Effects and I can just re-export the final clip. Now that we've got that done, we can close out of Photoshop and go back to After Effects. I'm going to go ahead and select all of my stills again. And then now I'm going to drag them into the project panel here in After Effects. I will need to track my footage. So I'm going to have to go over here to the tracker panel. And what we're going to do is track camera. Maybe we'll go from the start. And we'll click track camera and wait for that to track. So what the track camera does is it analyzes the shot and it finds track markers from inside of the scene, which you can essentially use to track other objects to those markers. So we can find a track marker that would represent where the character might be at the given freeze frame and then attach the freeze frame to that point so it stays where we want it to stay as the shot moves. So now that the camera track is done, you'll see that if we select our layer and we select our camera tracker, we get this target looking thing that moves about amongst the track points that we have. and it's sort of helping us to define a ground plane. We want to identify a ground plane that matches the perspective of the ground in the shot. So this part here looks pretty good, I think. If I click now at this point and I get this little triangulation between 3 track marks, I can now right click and I can go create solid and camera. So now this solid, if we were to play this back, is actually tracked in to the shot where our target track plane was. You can see it looks pretty good. So we're going to go back to our marker time. So with our track layer selected, I'm going to click and drag my first Photoshop still, and I'm actually going to hold Option or Alt and then release it over the track solid. This is going to replace that track solid with our first still image. So now you can see our first still image is tracked into the scene in the same place as that solid. But slight problem, it is at a completely weird angle that is not at all correct. So now using the orientation, position, and scale controls on that still layer, I'm going to manipulate it and align it to the actual footage layer so that it overlaps over the subject perfectly, or as perfect as I can get it. That looks pretty good to me right there. I can no longer really tell where my reference frame is and where my still image overlay is. So all I'm going to do is now cut the end of my still image so that it finishes at this frame. That way, as soon as the playhead moves on and the footage keeps playing, we won't have that still there anymore. So there's something else we can do to help to sell this effect, to sort of marry the shots together between the still and the actual footage. And that is to use a camera lens blur to create depth of field, or at least to fake depth of field. Because as the camera moves, the depth of field is going to change, and our still layer currently doesn't really understand that. So what we need to do is keyframe some blur on the top of it, a camera lens blur will do, and that way it'll look like it's being affected by the camera's depth of field, and it will sell the idea that it's a part of the shot. So to do that, I'm going to go to my effects panel over here. I'm going to search for camera lens blur. There we go. Click and drag that onto my layer here. What I'm going to try and do is just match the blur levels between this point on the ground about here and this point on my subject about here. Even just 2 might work really well. I'm going to go ahead and keyframe that now so that by the time that it reaches our actual frame, there is no blur left, because that would be what is actually happening with the depth of field. The depth of field is going to be moving. So now I'm going to do the same thing with stills 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to bring them in to a solid that I've already created based on my ground plane. I'm then going to readjust the orientation so it matches my freeze frame, and then add a camera lens blur. And I'm also going to make sure that I chop it so that it ends after the frame where the character hits that pose. So the only thing I need to notice is that this time when I right click, it won't let me create a new solid and camera. It just says create a solid because we've already got a camera. I can only have 1 camera. That's okay, just create a new solid and use that the same as you would previously. One suggestion I do have, especially if you're shooting just a subject that's walking towards you, is you get them to move from side to side and do actions off center, not in the direct center. Because in my shot here, I sort of had a bit of an issue where the subject was overlapping herself, and every time that a new freeze frame comes in, it actually just blocks out the previous one and you can't see what's happening. Now I got creative with this and solved it with a fun little opacity effect that sort of just fades in the freeze frame so that you can still see the action behind it, but the freeze frame comes in afterwards. But another cool way to do it, which is arguably easier, is just to have your subject moving off center and then doing the actions there. Let's take a look at our final effect. This is a super cool technique. I think it's just super creative and there's so many ways you could use it. So I'm super keen to see how you use it in your own films. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you got some value from today's video. If you have any questions or you didn't understand anything, let me know in the comments down below. I'll do my best to get down there and help you out. And whilst you're down there, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And by the way, only the people with the notification bell ticked are going to be alerted about all the cool things going on my channel this year. Make sure that you are one of those people. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next week, Wednesday. Or not. Maybe it'll be Thursday next week. I don't know. It's my channel. I'll do whatever I want. I will see you next week. See you then.